This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. On Sunday, Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria, uh, was forced out of office, forced out of the country, fled to Russia after a quick rebel advance against his government. And this, of course, is the culmination of a 13-year effort to overthrow Assad's government that has been described as a dirty war, a proxy war, a civil war, foreign intervention, foreign invasion, lots of different descriptors out there to describe what has happened in Syria over the past 13 years, popular uprising as well. Some have described it in that way. What's happened, it seems, over the past 48 hours, specifically with regards to Israel bombing, announcing its biggest ever in the history of the country's warfare, a bombing campaign of Syria, something like 480 targets blew up. Israel's claiming it's blown up 80% of the military assets of the Syrian military, and a former affiliate of Al-Qaeda is in charge of Damascus now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, as the acronym is widely used. Um, amongst this discussion, amongst this rapidly evolving situation, there's been very little discussion of Canada's role in the ouster of Assad and his policy towards Syria over the past 13 years. And to discuss that, I have with us Ken Stone from the Syria Support Movement and the longtime treasurer of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. So, first of all, Ken, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And can you just give us, before getting into the Canada angle, can you just tell us what's your kind of assessment of recent developments?
Well, to be frank, Eve, I'm sick to my stomach over the illegal overthrow of the government of Syria, previously led by President Bashar al-Assad. And this is a catastrophe for the Syrian people, for the Palestinians, for the Lebanese, and for the axis of resistance. And I don't, you described them loosely as rebels, but these guys who overthrew the Syrian government, the legitimate Syrian government that had been democratically elected many times. These people were neither rebels nor Democrats. Most of the people who comprise HTS are foreign fighters who come from many countries. Only about 10% of them are Syrians. They come from Chechnya, from Uzbekistan, from China, from Turkey, from Bosnia, and from many other countries. These are terrorist mercenaries connected to Al-Qaeda and its latest iteration, HTS, in Syria. Syria was a secular government, and it was the protector of the religious and ethnic minorities in Syria, the Christians, the Druze, the Alawites, the Kurds, and so on. And I fear for the future of these people, because in previous episodes, when the terrorists had come into Syria and Iraq, they chopped off the heads of all these people from different religious and ethnic minorities. And on top of that, Syria was also a self-proclaimed socialist country. It offered free education. It had universal Medicare, including pharmacare, which Canada is only just starting to establish. 95% of Syrians own their own houses outright with no mortgages. There was no national debt. The life expectancy increased from 56 to 72 under Bashar al-Assad. So this was a prosperous and self-respecting country that was able to, most years, to export food and now it's been dragged down. It was also a defender of the Palestinians, the most ardent defender of all the Arab countries of the Palestinian cause, for which they paid the ultimate price. And it was the beating heart of the axis of resistance. So, for all these reasons, I'm uh, I'm feeling very low today. But I am especially disappointed in those Canadians, and there's some right here in Hamilton, who call themselves Palestinian solidarity activists, and yet they supported the regime change operation in Syria. And I think now we are looking at terrible times for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and also the Lebanese in South Lebanon. So these people who supported the regime change operation and called themselves Palestinian solidarity activists, I think they are going to have some terrible things on their conscience. Anyway, you asked me what Canada's
Yeah.
role is.
Yeah. So
So
okay. Well, first of all, I think there would be some people that obviously would take umbrage with the notion of democratic elected. I have a hard time personally buying this is a father to son rule for 50 years. So whether there, I think that there is really important points in terms of the protecting of religious minorities, and there's also some important points with regards to social development that are kind of left aside. But leaving all that aside, there's lots and lots of places to have widespread discussions about Assad and Syria and that kind of stuff. But what there isn't much discussion about, and I think what's really important for people in Canada to know, and this is where I believe genuine internationalism is rooted is holding our government and our political culture in check in terms of its role in destabilizing governments, its role in violating international law, and the like. And with regards to Syria, there's very little discussion about just how kind of aggressive Canada was under Harper in terms of really targeting Syria. So they actually created this state sponsor of terrorism list in 2012, and Syria and Iran were put on that list. And that's at a time, kind of somewhat ironically, when the Syrian government was under assault from Al Qaeda, right? Which I think everyone agrees is a terrorist organization. So while a government's being attacked by a terrorist organization, you label that group a state sponsor of terrorism. And Justin Trudeau, um, uh, he, sorry, I don't know if I have my sheet here with his quote, but when he um, uh, applauded Assad being overthrown, he puts out this tweet where he says that hopefully now terrorism is over in Syria, which is I think again particularly ironic considering it's a former affiliate of Al Qaeda that's actually now in charge in Damascus. But yeah, so can you give us just a little bit of Canada's role in the sanctions, funding opposition groups, and the like, going back to 2011 in the destabilization of the Assad government.
okay, I'll do my best. Um, I would say overall, the thesis would be that Canada was playing its traditional role as a willing accomplice of the U.S. empire in what it did in Syria, and trying to destabilize, delegitimize the Syrian government, and in order and to help the people who were anointed by the U.S. government as the freedom fighters in Syria. It starts, Canada's role, as far as I know, starts in December of 2011 when Glenn Davidson, Canada's ambassador in Tunisia, organizes a pre meeting for the founding meeting, which I think was in February of 2012 in Tunis, of an organization put together by Hillary Clinton, who was Obama's Secretary of State. It was the group was called the Friends of Syria group of countries. And so Mr. Davidson laid the groundwork in Tunis for this meeting in 2011. A meeting happened early the next year. There were, I think, 70 countries that Hillary Clinton managed to lasso into this meeting, and they decided that they were going to help the U.S. Achieve a regime change in Syria, which of course is totally illegal and in violation of international law. Nonetheless, they met for several days and they divided up the tasks. The Qataris and the Saudi Arabians were going to fund the event, fund the war. The NATO, including the UK, France, Germany, they were going to undertake the training and supplying of weapons to the mercenaries. Um, the um, the United States ran a rat line, which Seymour Hersh called it a rat line of the remaining weapons that were in the stash of the overturned Libyan government. They ran that from Libya into Turkey, where these arms were given to the terrorists. And Canada was there, and Canada's role was to pledge I believe it was initially 326 million, later became 600 million for taking care of the refugees that were going to be inevitably produced by this regime change operation. And so the this Friends of Syria group of countries unleashed these terrorist mercenaries into Syria, where they caused havoc. They invaded cities and the countryside along the borders. They were inserted over the borders from Lebanon and from Jordan and from Turkey, and it caused major dislocations of the civilian population. And in the fighting that resulted from these terrorist bands coming in, there were about somewhere between 100 and 125,000 of them at their maximum, and in small groups of maybe 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 at a time in different areas and in different places. And the Syrian government resisted them. There was tremendous bloodshed and destruction of civilian infrastructure, and a huge refugee crisis. 12 million Syrians were internally displaced, which is, I think, about a third of the pre-war population. About 5-6 million Syrians became external refugees in Lebanon and in Turkey, and then many of them went up from Turkey into Europe, caused a great kerfuffle there. And on top of all that, the Friends of Syria group of countries, FSG, organized a campaign of coercive economic measures, which are commonly known as economic sanctions. They established a subcommittee on sanctions, and they had meetings in various capitals. And in Ottawa, in 2013, in June, they finally drew up a brutal regime of economic sanctions against Syria, which was implemented by all the countries of the FSG. And the result of that was that the Syrian currency plummeted in value. The Syrian trade declined dramatically. Unemployment rose to levels of about 60%. People could not afford to put food on their tables. And so that was the cause of many of the refugees leaving the country altogether. Those sanctions were redoubled and increased in 2020 by under Harper. Those sanctions were tightened 11 times, according to the Government of Canada's website. And in 2020, under I think it was it under was introduced in 2020. The U.S. government introduced something called the Caesar sanctions, which were a step above these sanctions, the original sanctions, in that they made it such that secondary countries and who might be involved in, or banks or corporations that might be involved in trade with Syria would also be sanctioned by the U.S. government. So it was a question, things that were done in other countries outside the realm of the U.S. were termed to be illegal by the U.S. So this is a process called extraterritoriality. And it made it impossible for even NGOs or charities to raise money for humanitarian and medical reasons to send money or help into Syria. So things got absolutely abysmal in Syria after 2020. 80% of the Syrian people were rendered food insecure, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed. The no parts for energy replacement, and so people were getting electricity for 3-4 hours a day, rotating blackouts. It was a terrible, and people were hungry. So it was a terrible situation, and this was all done, started by the Friends of Syria group, which the Canadian government under Harper or helped to organize in 2011. On top of that, the Harper government outrightly supported the instruments that the U.S. set up for a regime change. I'm talking about the Syrian National Council, which the Canadian government recognized, and they brought representatives of it. This is the Regime Change Council, which was never elected by anybody. Did not. It was a bunch of expatriate Syrians whom the Americans fingered for the job. These people had no representation, were not representative of anyone other than the interests of the U.S. State Department. But nonetheless, the Harper government sent John Baird to Turkey, according to the National Post. Canada opened its embassy in Ankara and made these Syrian National Council people regular visitors in the embassy. In addition, John Baird brought them to Ottawa and treated them as if they were national heroes, freedom fighters, liberators. So, though, on top of that, there was a campaign used in Syria by the U.S. To delegitimize and to what's another word for it? I'll use just the word delegitimize right now. They were accusing of the Syrian government, stigmatize, I guess. They were accusing the Syrian government of using chemical weapons against their own people. And there was an incident in a town called Hula in 2012, in May 29th. And that was the excuse for which the Canadian government cut off diplomatic relations under Harper with the Syrian government, and closed the embassy in Ottawa, closed the Syrian embassy in Ottawa, closed our embassy in Damascus. And John Baird continued to go to the meetings of the Friends of Syria group inside Friends of Syria group, where they had them in Morocco, for example, and other countries on a regular basis, I think once or twice a year. It turned out, of course, that the United Nations did an investigation. They hired Carla Del Ponte to investigate the chemical incident in Hula and in 3 other chemical incidents. After some time, she delivered a report to the UN, and that report indicated that, in her opinion, the likelihood was greater that the terrorist mercenaries had unleashed these chemical attacks as false flag operations than the Syrian government. That was her finding. In 2013, as there was a chemical weapons team from the IPCW, International, oh God, it's the United Nations Chemical, it's for the prohibition of chemical weapons. And it's the United Nations Institute. and they sent a team to Damascus in 2013. And just the day they arrived, there was a chemical incident, allegedly, in Ghouta, close to Damascus. And at that particular time, the Obama was planning. He was going to use that alleged chemical attack as um, as a pretext for an invasion, a direct military intervention into Syria. And what happened then was, of course, Obama was saying, and all the usual suspects in NATO were saying that this chemical attack was carried out by the Syrian government, and they were going to stage an intervention into the country. Um, you yourself, Eve, reported that as preparation for this proposed military intervention, there was a delegation of Canadian military officers, including generals, who were sent to Jordan. And they had been there for months. So clearly, this was very well planned in advance. It turned out that Obama saying that Assad using weapons of mass destruction against his own people was not bought by the American people. Actually, it was very inspiring at the time because American citizens contacted their members of Congress and senators, and they put so much pressure on the Congress that the Congress refused to accept Obama's plan to attack Syria directly. At the same time, in the British House of Commons, for the first time in a couple of hundred years, a government motion for war was likewise defeated. So it looked like there was going to be some kind of standoff at that time, but the Russians stepped in under President Vladimir Putin and offered to persuade the Syrian government to rid itself of its chemical stocks, which was done on U.S. ships in due course. Nonetheless, there were still a number of alleged chemical incidents, and a number of these, including one in 2017, was carried out by a group called the White Helmets. The White Helmets were a propaganda organization that was part of the regime change operation. It was initiated by British military intelligence. The operative was John Le Mesurier, a former British officer, and he was given a lot of money, something like 20, 30, $40 million over time by the British government, also by the Dutch government, the Canadian government, and the U.S. government to show that the Syrian government was using chemical weapons against its people, and they staged a incident in Douma in 2017, and there were a number of journalists who went there to examine it for themselves, including Tucker Carlson and Eva Bartlett of Canada, and it was found, and it was later proven by Aaron Mate, who was using the statistics and the reports of the IPCW itself, that there was no chemical attack, that it was an elaborate ruse that was orchestrated by this group called the White Helmets, which purported to be a civil defense organization, first responders. And in Canada, our government, the Trudeau government, was one of those governments that supported the White Helmets, and even bringing some of them to Canada and putting them on a tour of Canada. So the Canadian government was part of the propaganda, they provided help for this propaganda apparatus called the White Helmets. And when the White Helmets got into trouble in Dara, which is a city in the southern part of Syria, I think it was around 2019 or 2020. And because the Syrian government liberated the city of Dara at that time, they had to escape. It was the Canadian government that rescued, allegedly, or was instrumental, or at least Chrystia Freeland claimed to be instrumental in rescuing these white helmets, who only operated, by the way, in the terrorist occupied areas of Syria. Um, and they were brought out of Syria by the Israelis through the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, taken from there into Jordan, and then brought back to be resettled in Canada. So this was the role that the Trudeau government played in that propaganda operation. Also, when he was first elected in 2015, uh, or when he was running for election first in 2015, um, Justin Trudeau promised to improve relations with countries in West Asia. He promised to restore relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, which he never did once he got into office. And when he got into office, when he ran, rather, he also promised to end Canada's role in the U.S. Coalition to fight ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And in 2014 or so, one of the there was a mushrooming of one of these terrorist groups that came from Al Qaeda called ISIS, or the Islamic State, in the Levant, and they took over a huge swath of Syria and Iraq. And there's a lot of evidence, which I won't go into now, that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia were behind the origins of this group called ISIS, which most people remember as being head choppers and barbarians. And the U.S. Used the presence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq as a reason to keep their troops in Iraq and expand their influence into Syria. And so they set up a coalition in which Canada, as usual, was a willing participant. Harper sent in 6 F-18, CF-18 fighter jets to be part of this coalition, and plus some reconnaissance planes, one refueler, and one other plane I can't recall. And so when he was running for election at the first time in 2015, Trudeau said that he would remove the fighter jets from Syria because he knew that a lot of Canadians didn't like the fact that, unlike in Iraq, the U.S. and Canada did not have any permission to operate in Syria. So a blatant violation of international law and the sovereignty, the principle of national sovereignty, in a violation of the UN Charter. So when he was elected, it took him a very long time to remove the fighter jets. What he did was he just shifted them over from Syria to Iraq, but he kept sorry, I got that wrong. What he did was he removed the fighter jets eventually, but he left in the U.S. coalition the refuelers and the surveillance planes and the transport planes as well. So he was still part of an illegal operation in a country in which Canada was not invited to participate. And that went on for quite some time before Trudeau moved the operation over into Iraq. And then the Canadian government got involved with the Kurds and then with the Iraqi government. So throughout this whole period, the Canadian government has been, as usual, a junior partner in U.S. foreign policy, and not by any force or coercion, but as you've always pointed out, Eve, they are willing accomplices of the empire, of the U.S. empire, just as previously, as you've pointed out in many of your books, they were willing accomplices of the British Empire. So this has been the role of our government over the period of the last 13 years during this regime change operation, which finally, for their purposes, succeeded the other day in Syria.
Well, thanks a lot for that very comprehensive overview. I think it's absolutely essential when we're hearing so much about what's going on in Syria, and but so little about Canada's role. And people absolutely, it's essential if you want to make sense of the violence. You have to know the history, and this is obviously just a short piece of the history. But if you go back even broader in the history of colonial carving up of Syria and the creation of the borders from the French and the British and stuff like that, that's also important context to understand. And I think that most people who are looking at what Canada's been supporting in Gaza understand now that Canadian policy in the Middle East or in West Asia is not one of seeking to bring democracy and human rights. It seems abundantly clear that that's not Israel's objective, and yet Canada is supporting that. But in fact, if you look around the world, you'll find that that is very rarely what the Canadian government is trying to do, but rather usually it's about advancing geostrategic interests or excuse me, or corporate interests. And I think that Ken, you have laid out very well the Canadian history over the past 13 years in what, of course, is, as you put it early on, the Syrian tragedy. But it's not just a Syrian tragedy. I think it's a tragedy for the resistance in Lebanon. I think it's a tragedy for Palestinians and probably more broadly, or very likely more broadly, the sectarian violence and warfare is plausibly going to be spreading further throughout the region. So it's important to know Canada's role in this. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy to detail Canada's role in Syria.
Can I make one last point?
Go ahead.
I think the logic of all this is that Canada needs to develop an independent foreign policy, one that's based on peace, a cooperation with all the countries of the world, and a foreign policy that means that removes Canada from NATO, because that U.S. military alliance, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, draws us into every war of the U.S. empire. And it drew us into the war in Syria as well, with the awful consequences that have happened so far and are yet to happen in the coming days.
Yeah, and it should be noted that the Canada out of NATO is not a message that's gets much attention in dominant media, but there are organizations, one that you're part of, the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, another one that you're part of, the Canadian-wide Peace and Justice Network, that are trying to put that message out into the public. I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy.
My pleasure, Eve. Thank you.